far too silent. Not because there were no animals, not because the wind had stopped, but because somewhere deep in the darkness of Vietnam, men were waiting to kill each other. Young Americans barely old enough to drink sat trembling inside wet foxholes, clutching rifles with shaking hands, while invisible enemies moved through the trees around them. They couldn't see them, they rarely heard them, but they knew they were there. And within seconds, the jungle would explode into absolute hell. Machine guns, napalm, screaming, burning flesh, and fear so overwhelming. Some soldiers would later say Vietnam never truly ended for them. Even decades later, they still heard the jungle at night. This was not the clean, heroic war America imagined. This was something darker, something psychological. A war where soldiers died without ever seeing the enemy, where civilians became targets, where teenagers were dropped into an environment so horrifying that many returned home completely broken. And for the Vietnamese people, the nightmare was even worse. Because while America would eventually leave Vietnam behind, Vietnam itself would remain scarred forever. Entire villages erased, forests burned from the sky, children born decades later still suffering from chemicals dropped during the war. But perhaps the most disturbing part of all was that many of the men making decisions in Washington already suspected the war could not truly be won. And yet, they continued sending more troops, more bombs, more bodies, because by the 1960s, Vietnam had become more than a war. It had become a test of pride, a global psychological battle between communism and capitalism, and millions of ordinary people would pay the price to understand how America became trapped in the jungles of Vietnam. You first have to understand the fear that ruled the world after World War II. The year was 1945. Europe was in ruins. Entire cities had been reduced to ash. But while one war had ended, another invisible conflict was already beginning. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged from World War II as two global superpowers, and almost immediately, they began viewing each other as mortal enemies. The Americans feared communism would spread across the planet like a disease. Washington believed that if one country became communist, neighboring countries would eventually follow. This became known as the domino theory. And nowhere did that fear grow stronger than in Asia. China had already fallen to communism in 1949 under Mao Zedong. Then came Korea, a brutal war that killed millions and ended in stalemate. By the time the 1950s arrived, American leaders were terrified that Southeast Asia might collapse next, and hidden inside the steaming jungles of French Indochina, a revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh was waiting. To many Vietnamese people, Ho Chi Minh was not a villain. He was a symbol of independence. For decades, Vietnam had been controlled by the French colonial empire. Vietnamese workers were exploited, resources were stolen, resistance was crushed, and Ho Chi Minh believed Vietnam deserved freedom. But there was one problem. Ho Chi Minh was also communist, and in Washington, that single fact changed everything. To American politicians, Vietnam was no longer just a colonial struggle. It became another battlefield in the Cold War, another place where communism had to be stopped at any cost, even if most Americans could barely locate Vietnam on a map. At first, the United States avoided direct involvement. Instead, America quietly funded France's war against Vietnamese revolutionaries. Billions of dollars flowed into the conflict. Weapons, supplies, military aid. But despite superior equipment, the French were fighting an enemy willing to endure unimaginable suffering. The Viet Minh hid in jungles, moved through tunnels, blended into villages, and most importantly, they believed they were fighting for their homeland. That kind of motivation is almost impossible to destroy. Then came 1954, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, a remote valley surrounded by dense hills. French commanders believed they could lure Vietnamese forces into open battle and crush them with superior firepower. Instead, they walked directly into disaster. Vietnamese fighters dragged heavy artillery through mountains and jungle by hand. Some died simply transporting the weapons. But once the guns were in position, the French fortress became a death trap. Explosions ripped through bunkers day and night. Mud swallowed bodies. Supplies vanished. The French were slowly strangled inside the valley, and after weeks of relentless bombardment, France surrendered. The defeat shocked the world. A colonial empire had just been humiliated by guerrilla fighters in sandals. But America drew a different lesson from the battle. Washington became convinced that if Vietnam fully fell to communism, the entire region might follow. So instead of leaving Vietnam alone, the United States stepped deeper into the conflict. Vietnam was divided into two parts: the communist North under Ho Chi Minh and the anti-communist South, supported by America. On paper, elections were supposed to reunite the country, but US officials feared Ho Chi Minh would win easily, so the elections never happened. And slowly, Vietnam began sliding toward full-scale war. At first, American involvement seemed limited: military advisors, training programs, equipment. But beneath the surface, the situation was already unraveling. South Vietnam's government was deeply corrupt. Many rural villagers distrusted it completely. Some viewed the Americans not as liberators, but as foreign occupiers replacing the French. Meanwhile, communist fighters in the south, known as the Viet Cong, grew stronger. They assassinated officials, ambushed patrols, disappeared into villages before soldiers could respond, and every year the violence intensified. Then came the early 1960s. President John F. Kennedy increased American presence dramatically. Thousands of military advisors entered Vietnam. Helicopters became symbols of the war. Their blades thundered over jungles and rice fields as America tried to hunt an enemy that rarely fought directly. But Vietnam was unlike anything the US military had prepared for. There were no clear front lines, no obvious battlefields, no guaranteed victories. The jungle itself felt alive. It swallowed sound. Heat exhausted soldiers constantly. Leeches clung to skin. Rot spread through boots and uniforms, and somewhere beyond the trees, invisible enemies watched every movement. American soldiers began experiencing a terrifying form of psychological warfare. Booby traps, punji stakes coated with filth, tripwires connected to grenades, snipers hidden in tunnels. You could survive a massive firefight and die moments later from a single hidden trap. The fear became constant. Every step might be your last. And that fear slowly changed people. Many soldiers arrived believing they were defending freedom, but after months in the jungle, morality became blurred. Because the enemy did not wear uniforms, farmers by day could become fighters at night. Women carried weapons, children sometimes planted explosives. The paranoia became suffocating. And in war, paranoia is deadly. Then, in 1963, the South Vietnamese government spiraled deeper into chaos. Buddhist monks protested against corruption and oppression. One image shocked the entire world. A monk named Thich Quang Duc calmly sat in the street while flames consumed his body. He never moved, never screamed. The photograph became one of the most disturbing symbols of the era, and it revealed something terrifying to American officials. Their ally in South Vietnam was collapsing from within. Soon after, South Vietnamese leader Ngo Dinh Diem was overthrown and killed in a coup supported indirectly by the United States, but removing him solved nothing. Instead, political instability worsened, and America found itself sinking deeper into a conflict nobody fully understood. Then came August 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. According to US officials, American ships had been attacked by North Vietnamese forces. The event triggered outrage in Washington. President Lyndon B. Johnson gained authority to massively expand the war. Bombing campaigns intensified. Troops poured into Vietnam. America was now fully committed. But years later, serious doubts emerged about what actually happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. Some historians believe parts of the incident were exaggerated or misinterpreted, yet by then, it no longer mattered. The machinery of war was already moving, and soon, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers would enter Vietnam. Most of them were incredibly young, 19, 20, 21. Many had never traveled far from home before arriving in Southeast Asia. Some came from small farms, others from crowded American cities. Black soldiers, white soldiers, rich kids, poor kids, all thrown into the same nightmare. And almost immediately, reality shattered whatever fantasies they had about war. Vietnam was chaos. The humidity suffocated them. Rain turned battlefields into swamps. Mosquitoes spread disease. The smell of death lingered everywhere. Sometimes bodies remained in the jungle for days because retrieving them was too dangerous. And then there was the waiting, the endless, terrifying waiting. Patrols moved slowly through dense vegetation where visibility was often only a few feet. Every sound became horrifying. A snapped branch, rustling leaves. Suddenly machine gun fire would erupt from nowhere. Men dropped instantly. Screaming medics crawled through mud trying to save bodies torn apart by bullets and shrapnel. Hen just as quickly. The attackers vanished back into the jungle. American firepower was overwhelming. Jets screamed overhead. Napalm engulfed forests in fire. Artillery shook the earth. But the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces adapted constantly. They used elaborate tunnel systems stretching for miles underground. Inside these tunnels were hospitals, storage rooms, weapon caches, entire hidden communities beneath the earth. American soldiers, called tunnel rats, were sometimes sent inside armed only with pistols and flashlights. It was one of the most terrifying jobs in the war. Claustrophobic darkness, hidden traps, enemy fighters waiting inches away. Some soldiers entered tunnels and never returned. Meanwhile, the war back home in America was beginning to change. Television crews captured graphic footage unlike anything previous generations had seen. Dead soldiers, burned villages, terrified civilians. For the first time, war entered American living rooms almost every night, and public opinion slowly began shifting. But in Vietnam, the killing continued escalating. Then came 1968, the Tet Offensive, one of the most shocking moments of the entire war. During the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, Communist forces launched massive coordinated attacks across South Vietnam. Cities erupted in violence. Even the US Embassy compound in Saigon was attacked. Militarily, American and South Vietnamese forces eventually pushed the attackers back. The Viet Cong suffered enormous losses, but psychologically, Tet changed everything. Because the offensive shattered the illusion that America was close to victory. If the enemy was supposedly weakened, how could they launch attacks on this scale? Millions of Americans began questioning what their government had been telling them. And inside Vietnam, the brutality intensified further. In the ancient city of Hue, street fighting became savage and relentless. Buildings collapsed under artillery fire. Civilians were trapped between both sides. Executions occurred. Mass graves were later discovered. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Vietnam was becoming a war without innocence, a conflict where everyone suffered. Then came one of the darkest atrocities of the war. March the 16th, 1968. My Lai. American soldiers entered a village expecting enemy fighters. Instead, what followed became one of the most horrifying war crimes in US military history. Unarmed civilians were killed, women, children, elderly villagers. Some victims were executed at close range, others died in ditches filled with bodies. At first, the massacre was covered up, but eventually the truth emerged, and when Americans learned what happened, the moral foundation of the war cracked even further because Vietnam was no longer just about communism. Now people were asking deeper questions. What was this war turning ordinary men into? How much brutality could human beings justify before losing themselves completely? Many soldiers carried enormous psychological scars. Some turned to drugs simply to cope. Others became emotionally numb. A disturbing number returned home, unable to reconnect with a normal life. And unlike previous wars, Vietnam veterans often did not receive heroic welcomes. Some Americans viewed them as symbols of a deeply unpopular war. The isolation many veterans experienced would haunt them for decades. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese remained astonishingly determined. Despite catastrophic casualties, they continued fighting. Entire generations sacrificed themselves believing reunification was worth any price. The Ho Chi Minh Trail became legendary, a vast network through jungles and mountains used to move troops and supplies. American bombing campaigns tried relentlessly to destroy it, but the trail survived, again and again. Because the war had become more than military strategy. It had become a battle of endurance, and slowly, America's will was eroding. Back in the United States, protests exploded nationwide. College campuses filled with anti-war demonstrations. Young Americans burned draft cards. Some fled to Canada to avoid conscription. Others believed the war was necessary to stop communism. The country became deeply divided. Families argued. Friendships collapsed. The Vietnam War was no longer just happening overseas. It was tearing America apart internally. Then, in 1970, the war spread into Cambodia. President Richard Nixon authorized operations targeting communist sanctuaries across the border. The decision triggered even more outrage. At Kent State University, National Guard troops opened fire on protesting students. 4 young people were killed. The image of a screaming student kneeling beside a dead body became another symbol of a country unraveling under the pressure of war. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, bombing campaigns intensified to staggering levels. Entire regions of Laos and Cambodia were devastated. To this day, unexploded bombs from the conflict still kill civilians decades later. And then there was Agent Orange. One of the most controversial aspects of the war, the US military sprayed millions of gallons of chemical defoliants across Vietnam to destroy jungle cover. The immediate goal was tactical: strip away vegetation-hiding enemy fighters. But the long-term consequences became catastrophic. Forests were poisoned, villages contaminated, and countless people later suffered cancers, birth defects, and chronic illnesses linked to chemical exposure. Even American veterans were affected. For many, the war continued inside their own bodies long after returning home. By the early 1970s, American leaders knew public support was collapsing. Nixon began reducing US troop numbers while trying to strengthen South Vietnamese forces. This policy became known as Vietnamization. The hope was that South Vietnam could continue fighting without massive American ground involvement, but morale was deteriorating. Many soldiers no longer believed victory was possible. And the North Vietnamese understood something crucial. They did not necessarily need to defeat America militarily. They simply needed to outlast them. Eventually, that is exactly what happened. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. American combat forces officially withdrew. For many Americans, the war felt finished. But for Vietnam, the final nightmare was still approaching. Without large-scale US support, South Vietnam weakened rapidly. Then, in 1975, the North launched its final offensive. City after city collapsed. Refugees flooded roads, desperately trying to escape advancing forces. Panic spread through Saigon, and on April 30th, 1975, the world witnessed one of the most iconic scenes of the entire war: helicopters lifting people from rooftops as the city fell. Desperate civilians climbed embassy walls hoping for evacuation. Some were left behind, others clung to aircraft in terror. Then, finally, Saigon fell. The Vietnam War was over. Communist forces unified the country. America had lost its longest war up to that point. But perhaps the deepest wounds were invisible. Nearly 60,000 American soldiers were dead. Millions of Vietnamese civilians and fighters had perished. Entire landscapes were destroyed. Families shattered forever, and psychologically. The war transformed both nations. In America, trust in government suffered enormous damage. Many citizens began questioning official narratives more than ever before. The phrase Vietnam Syndrome emerged to describe the nation's deep reluctance toward future military interventions. For veterans, the scars often lasted a lifetime. Nightmares, PTSD, addiction, depression. Some never escaped the jungle mentally. Even decades later, certain sounds could trigger panic: rainfall, helicopter blades, fireworks. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, recovery was painfully slow. The country remained devastated economically and physically. Unexploded ordnance continued killing civilians. Chemical contamination lingered. And yet, despite everything, Vietnam endured. Today, bustling cities stand where battlefields once burned. Young generations walk streets once covered in rubble and blood. But the memory of the war still shadows the nation. And perhaps the most haunting question remains this: how did one of the most powerful military forces in human history become trapped in a conflict it could not win? The answer lies partly in arrogance, partly in fear, and partly in a tragic misunderstanding of human determination. Because wars are not won only with weapons. They are won through belief. And throughout the Vietnam War, millions of Vietnamese fighters believed they were defending their homeland, no matter the cost, while many American soldiers increasingly wondered why they were there at all. In the end, That difference changed history, and somewhere tonight, an old veteran may still wake suddenly from sleep, hearing helicopters in his mind, smelling smoke that no longer exists, remembering faces long gone, because for the men who survived Vietnam, the war never truly ended. Subscribe for more. For years after the war ended, questions continued haunting America. Not just questions about strategy or politics, but questions about morality. Because Vietnam forced the world to confront something deeply uncomfortable. How quickly civilized societies can descend into brutality when fear, ideology, and survival collide. Young men who once dreamed about college, marriage, or ordinary peaceful lives have been transformed into soldiers navigating landscapes filled with death. And many returned home feeling older than their years. Some veterans barely spoke about Vietnam for decades, not because they forgot, but because they remembered too clearly. The smell of burning villages, the cries for medics during firefights, the silence that followed ambushes, the faces of friends who never made it home. Many struggled with nightmares so vivid they felt real. Some slept with weapons beside their beds long after the war. Others isolated themselves from family and society entirely. PTSD became one of the hidden casualties of Vietnam, though at the time, few truly understood it. Instead, many veterans were told simply to move on, to forget. But war does not disappear because people stop talking about it. And Vietnam had changed an entire generation forever. Meanwhile, the political consequences of the war spread far beyond Southeast Asia. Trust in American leadership collapsed dramatically after the conflict. Government statements were no longer accepted so easily. Citizens questioned military interventions more critically than ever before. Journalists became more aggressive. Protests became more powerful. And the idea that America could never lose a war had been shattered permanently. For the Soviet Union and China, Vietnam represented proof that even a superpower could be resisted through persistence and sacrifice. For revolutionary movements across the world, it became a symbol, a lesson that determination could sometimes overcome technological superiority. But for Vietnam itself, victory came at a horrifying cost. Entire regions of the country had been devastated, forests poisoned, infrastructure destroyed, millions dead or wounded, families separated for generations. The psychological scars existed on both sides of the conflict, and rebuilding would take decades. Even after peace officially returned, life remained difficult. Economic hardship spread across the country. Former South Vietnamese soldiers were often imprisoned in re-education camps. Many civilians fled Vietnam entirely. Some escaped by boat across dangerous waters. These refugees became known as the Boat People. Thousands died attempting to flee. Pirates attacked vulnerable refugee boats. Storms swallowed entire families at sea. Yet still, they risked everything for a chance at survival elsewhere. The aftermath of war continued, creating suffering long after the final gunshots faded. And still, there remained the unexploded bombs, hidden beneath soil and jungle growth, silent reminders waiting decades to kill. Children playing in fields sometimes discovered deadly remnants buried underground. Farmers lost limbs while working land contaminated by war. Even generations born long after Vietnam ended continued living beside its dangers. Then there was Agent Orange, one of the most controversial legacies of the conflict. The chemical had been sprayed across enormous sections of Vietnam to destroy jungle cover and crops. but the long-term human consequences became catastrophic. Birth defects, cancers, neurological diseases, entire families affected across generations. Vietnamese civilians suffered immensely. American veterans suffered too, and for decades, many fought simply to have their illnesses recognized. The war had followed them home inside their own bodies, but perhaps one of the most chilling realities of Vietnam was how ordinary much of it eventually became to the people living through it. Humans adapt even to horror. Soldiers joked between firefights. Civilians continued trying to celebrate weddings and birthdays during bombings. Children still played near ruins. Life persisted stubbornly in the middle of destruction. And maybe that is one of the strangest truths about war, even in hell. Human beings continue searching for normality, for connection, for moments of hope. Yet Vietnam also revealed how fragile morality can become under extreme pressure. The constant fear blurred ethical boundaries. Body counts became measurements of success. Suspicion replaced trust. And in some units, the dehumanization of the enemy became dangerously complete. Atrocities occurred on all sides of the conflict. Civilians suffered repeatedly, and the distinction between innocence and guilt often disappeared beneath violence and paranoia, because guerrilla warfare creates a terrifying environment. For years after the war ended, questions continued haunting America. Not just questions about strategy or politics, but questions about morality. Because Vietnam forced the world to confront something deeply uncomfortable. How quickly civilized societies can descend into brutality when fear, ideology, and survival collide. Young men who once dreamed about college, marriage, or ordinary peaceful lives have been transformed into soldiers navigating landscapes filled with death. And many returned home feeling older than their years. Some veterans barely spoke about Vietnam for decades, not because they forgot, but because they remembered too clearly. The smell of burning villages, the cries for medics during firefights, the silence that followed ambushes, the faces of friends who never made it home. Many struggled with nightmares so vivid they felt real. Some slept with weapons beside their beds long after the war. Others isolated themselves from family and society entirely. PTSD became one of the hidden casualties of Vietnam, though at the time, few truly understood it. Instead, many veterans were told simply to move on, to forget. But war does not disappear because people stop talking about it. And Vietnam had changed an entire generation forever. Meanwhile, the political consequences of the war spread far beyond Southeast Asia. Trust in American leadership collapsed dramatically after the conflict. Government statements were no longer accepted so easily. Citizens questioned military interventions more critically than ever before. Journalists became more aggressive. Protests became more powerful. And the idea that America could never lose a war had been shattered permanently. For the Soviet Union and China, Vietnam represented proof that even a superpower could be resisted through persistence and sacrifice. For revolutionary movements across the world, it became a symbol, a lesson that determination could sometimes overcome technological superiority. But for Vietnam itself, victory came at a horrifying cost. Entire regions of the country had been devastated, forests poisoned, infrastructure destroyed, millions dead or wounded, families separated for generations. The psychological scars existed on both sides of the conflict, and rebuilding would take decades. Even after peace officially returned, life remained difficult. Economic hardship spread across the country. Former South Vietnamese soldiers were often imprisoned in re-education camps. Many civilians fled Vietnam entirely. Some escaped by boat across dangerous waters. These refugees became known as the Boat People. Thousands died attempting to flee. Pirates attacked vulnerable refugee boats. Storms swallowed entire families at sea. Yet still, they risked everything for a chance at survival elsewhere. The aftermath of war continued, creating suffering long after the final gunshots faded. And still, there remained the unexploded bombs, hidden beneath soil and jungle growth, silent reminders waiting decades to kill. Children playing in fields sometimes discovered deadly remnants buried underground. Farmers lost limbs while working land contaminated by war. Even generations born long after Vietnam ended continued living beside its dangers. Then there was Agent Orange, one of the most controversial legacies of the conflict. The chemical had been sprayed across enormous sections of Vietnam to destroy jungle cover and crops, but the long-term human consequences became catastrophic. Birth defects, cancers, neurological diseases, entire families affected across generations. Vietnamese civilians suffered immensely. American veterans suffered too, and for decades, many fought simply to have their illnesses recognized. The war had followed them home inside their own bodies, but perhaps one of the most chilling realities of Vietnam was how ordinary much of it eventually became to the people living through it. Humans adapt even to horror. Soldiers joked between firefights. Civilians continued trying to celebrate weddings and birthdays during bombings. Children still played near ruins. Life persisted stubbornly in the middle of destruction. And maybe that is one of the strangest truths about war, even in hell. Human beings continue searching for normality, for connection, for moments of hope. Yet Vietnam also revealed how fragile morality can become under extreme pressure. The constant fear blurred ethical boundaries. Body counts became measurements of success. Suspicion replaced trust. And in some units, the dehumanization of the enemy became dangerously complete. Atrocities occurred on all sides of the conflict. Civilians suffered repeatedly, and the distinction between innocence and guilt often disappeared beneath violence and paranoia, because guerrilla warfare creates a terrifying environment.